A Savile Row coat still clings to the man who steps through ash and wind. The cut is immaculate beneath cinders. The cloth holds memory of rain in London and the way a cigarette was once politely accepted. Cufflinks whisper of another world, cold, precise circles of steel, and in the guttered light, the metal catches something that is not flame. He exhales, and ash sifts from his lashes like gray snow. The first breath tastes of iron and old fire, and for an instant he thinks of better beds and small comforts that mean nothing here. He has come not to kill or to steal, but to speak with the one who wrought dominion itself, to bargain in a place where bargains are measured in kingdoms and the lives of the nameless. The reach he crosses is a gray no man's land, a place that seems to have forgotten the sky. The ground crunches underfoot with the brittle bones of burnt things. Far off, something that is not horses nor simple engines grinds and calls, metal on metal, a slow, patient turning that sounds like a clock somebody made for a siege. The sound sets his teeth on edge. It is the sound of preparation, not of victory. The air itself seems watchful, as if some great thing leans its ear to listen. There are no banners of free folk here, no bright standards to point to, only the pall and the slow drum of industry that fashions war. An escort meets him at the border where ash gives way to scorched stones. They are not soldiers in the uniforms he knows. They are lean, cloaked figures with faces that have been weathered into maps of endurance. One reaches out and offers him a thing that looks like a bowl hammered from the night, a disk of dull iron, warm as a living thing. The escort speaks, but his voice is quiet, old-fashioned in its courtesy and blunt in its meaning. He names the dark tower by a word the man recognizes, Barad-dûr. The name falls like a coin. It is both a place and a summons. This is the protocol of Middle-earth's diplomacy, the man is told. There is no embassy where one can march and unfurl the colors of negotiation. There is a summons, older than treaties, carried by more than our tongues. The disk, when placed to a palm, makes a pattern, a narrative that is not read but seen in the bones. It is not an invitation. It is a command wrapped in courtesy. It asks for what one brings with one and for what one will leave behind. He studies the disk. It has the weight of a promise and the warmth of a wound. He does not hide that he recognizes a summons when he sees one. Years of clandestine work have taught him to read pressure, to know when ink is a blade. Yet Sauron's summons is different. It does not merely demand papers or names. It demands a shape of self, what you will reveal of your intent, what you will offer for entry. It will, by some older logic, open for him the hall or bar the gate. The escort's eyes are steady. You will give them something, the envoy says, or they will take it. The words are simple. They do not pretend mercy. The man in the coat measures his options. Charm will work in courts and salons. A bluff will unsettle those who doubt the knife at their back. A hidden blade will settle questions irretrievably, but the hall beyond the summons will not answer to steel the way a highwayman answers to a pistol. He slides his fingers into the cuff of the immaculate coat, fingers that have felt silk and wire and bone. He thinks, briefly and without sentiment, of the many ways names open doors and the many ways names close them forever. He imagines the shape of his life paired against the demand of the disk, how much to reveal of the man who is bond, agent, and witness, and how much of the man who is simply a human breathing ash. To be honest here is to show weakness in a court that eats weakness. To conceal everything is to risk being treated as a cipher. not worthy of parley. Around them, the escort stand in a loose ring, a small island of living rain against a sea of ash. When they speak, it is to remind him of the strange instruments that run the diplomacy here. There are no printed summons, no envoys with quills, no flags to mark neutrality. The summons is an instrument of older craft, a token, a stone, a whispered name carried by a wind that remembers how mountains were arranged. It is an appeal to rule and to fear. It is also an invitation to an audience that will test the sort of courage that is not only measured by a trigger. He puts the disc against his palm. For a moment, the world narrows to the pattern that wakes beneath his skin. Shapes crawl along his tendons, not words in his language, but a sequence like a clockwork of expectations. The summons asks whether he is an envoy, a spy, a supplicant, or a thief. It guesses at his reason. He feels absurdly that the disc is smelling him. He hears again the low grinding of engines as if their rhythm is the heartbeat of the summons. The escort explains the consequence plainly. To enter that hall, you must offer a truth or you must surrender another's truth. The summons will accept either. No one here speaks of binding oaths lightly. He accepts a truth with one hand and knows already that it will expand in the hall like light through smoked glass. He can offer himself, his name, his purpose. He can offer a thing instead, a talisman, a promise, a compact made elsewhere, or he can choose cleverness, tell half-truths and let the other half be guessed. Each choice brings its own danger. He thinks about charm. He thinks about bluff. He thinks about a hidden blade. He feels the old reflex to prepare for the last, to make sure that if words fail him, cold steel will answer. Under the coat, the weight of a service weapon rests against the small of his back, secure and mute. The place does not forgive obvious metal, and the disc knows where metal sleeps. To fight before an audience that has already pronounced upon your intent is to surrender the field. A child of the shadow. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the last blackened crag, rolled a drum. The sound carries like a token. It does not belong to any province the man understands, yet he understands its sentence. The bell of a greater war has rung. Time here does not tick in hours but in grudges, and every echo matters. He decides finally to be something between a man of letters and a man of action. He will not throw down the truth like a coin meant to buy favor, nor will he feign empty hands. He reaches into an inner pocket and draws out a small object folded in cloth, a fragment of a map, inked with borders that are meaningless outside human considerations, and on the other side, a note with one sentence. He does not read the line aloud. He does not need to. The escorts watch as he presents the cloth and the disc together, aligning them so that the summoned pattern may read them at once. The iron disc warms further. The pattern in his palm alters, accepting the exchange. In that still instant, he feels the shape of the meeting change. The summons had tested him for what he was willing to reveal. He had answered with a measured honesty, enough to be recognized as a negotiator, perhaps, and not merely a pretender. He has not surrendered everything. He keeps the part that is most dangerous to himself, a small private lie and the muscle memory of a blade. The escort inclines his head as if at a private joke. "They will see you now," he says. The cloak figures step back, eyes on the path that leads to the tower. One by one, like shadows unseen by daylight, they turn and evaporate into the ash and wind. They do not walk away with feet that disturb the dust. They dissolve, as if the place itself drew them home. The man in the coat stands alone at the mouth of the lane that climbs toward the black tower. The sound of grinding engines sharpens into intent, a tide against which words must be cast. He straightens the collar of his coat, the motion precise and habitual, a last small ritual of civility. The cufflink gives a faint, familiar click. He tastes the ash again and notes with an odd domesticity the grit between his teeth. He thinks of those back home who will be shaped by the outcome of what he must do. He thinks of millions, unknown and uncounted, and how the lives of such folk are like iron filings arranged by a bell, obedient, helpless before a stronger pull. He thinks of Sauron and the one who forged dominion and the patience that rules such minds. From the tower there comes a light that is not kindly. It flares and dims, patient as a lantern that gauges a room. The path before him is a ribbon of heat and shadow. He steps forward into that light, into a corridor that smells of smelted things and old treaties. The stone here is carved with sigils that are not merely decoration, but instruments of appraisal. They seem to lean toward him, curious. He knows the first image of his opponent will be a test of proportion and of will. Sauron will not offer a face, for he wears power like a mask of flame. He will offer something to judge the measure of those who would parley, an image or a presence calibrated to extract fear or truth. The man in the Savile Row coat moves toward that image with the ease of someone who has been measured and found ready more than once. Still, he is aware that this audience will ask for more than the disc measured. It will ask for the weight of his soul in the balance. The corridor opens and the light changes, as if a curtain has been drawn between breaths. There is a figure within the hall, no mere man and no merely myth. It is an arrangement of shadow and intent, patient and ancient. The first impression is not a face, but calculation, the slow, precise arithmetic of a mind that has counted kingdoms as one counts coins. It watches him as if he might be an item to be weighed. It waits. He pauses at the threshold, one hand resting on the seam of his coat. He knows what the summons has promised and what it has not. He hears the gravel of the ground beyond the hall like a tide, threatening to swell. He makes, in that suspended moment, the smallest decision, whether to speak first and set the terms of the conversation, or to hold his tongue and let the present speak, letting the other shape the quarry. The choice will change everything that follows. He breathes. The ash on his lips tastes like a wager. He steps fully into the light. The first image of his opponent answers him with a patience that is not idle. And in that answering, the negotiation begins in earnest. The glass of the palantir lay between them like a pond whose surface remembered every sky. Its black bowl drank light, and then threw it back as a living portrait, a face in motion that was not so much seen as encountered. Sauron spoke, and the sound came without shift of shadow, voice like iron sifted through smoke, offering a bargain wrapped in inevitability. He would still the hoofs and the march voices for a season, he said. He would draw back the shadows that hung like banners over the valleys if Bond would take an oath and keep it. In return, he promised knowledge, maps folded into minds, names that would unmake alliances, a single hour in which the engines of war could not move. Bond listened as if he were reading a brief hidden in flame. He did not speak at once. Instead, he measured what could be offered, like a man scanning a room for exits. He could promise diversion, false roads, phantasms of supply convoys, whispers fed into the ears of captains who trusted the wrong messenger. He could promise intelligence stolen from camps, the location of watchfires and secret councils that made a general's night a chessboard. He could promise cunning, not force. Councils split by rumor, siege engines delayed by sabotaged rope. All these were things Bond could give with the right resources and a few reckless men. They could be the coin he paid to buy peace for a night, yet there was also what could be taken. Names foremost. A name in Middle-earth is a key. Said thusly it would open doors, call faces, and set folk to remembering debts. To hand over a name was to hand over a life. And then there were the loyalties he was not his to spend, the stubborn oaths of a ranger, the fierce private promises of a lord. He thought of those promises as delicate artifacts, porcelain that would shatter with one misstep. He felt the gravity of what Sauron asked for, not mere information, but an oath that bound more than breath. He saw, with a clarity Bond had long learned to prize, that Sauron wanted proof something more than promises could supply, proof that an allegiance could be made visible and irreversible. Sauron anticipated the calculation and answered with a demonstration. The Palantir trembled, its surface writhed like oil. An image came, crisp and terrible. A hand, palm up, its skin unmarked. Then a sigil of shifting shadow seared into flesh, not burning, not blistering, but as if the shadow itself had written. Where the mark lay, the light would no longer fall true in campfires. Those marked seemed dimmer, and dogs would turn away. The voice said, without malice and without haste, "This is how a vow is made known. This is what you will be asked to offer or apply. One such mark, given by one you name, will stand as testimony to your word. It will bind the marked to the side of the eye. It will speak for you when your throat is silent." Bond watched the image as if it were a dossier on arrival. He ran through contingencies as one runs a pencil over a map. If he gave Sauron a name to mark, an ally or an enemy, it would be a lever. A marked man could be shown in the Palantir at any time, and his choices would be known. A marked man would bear a brand that separated him from those he loved. Men would gather their own meaning around the mark. Allies would look upon him and see treachery or salvation according to need. That was the cruelty a mark that made truth impossible to conceal became a wound in fellowship. Bond's voice, when he used it, was the voice of someone in the habit of weighing risk to advantage. He asked what limits there were. Could the mark be removed? The Palantir showed the hand again. The sigil sank deeper than skin. It was not merely pigment or cut. It was a thing of shadow woven with will. Sauron said, flatly, "Only a power equal to mine could unmake what I make." Only then. The bargain was designed so that the proof would outlast any lesser treachery. Bond heard the edge behind the words. He heard the promise of knowledge transform into a sentence. Then Bond proposed the terms he could live with, carving counterweights from what he had. He would give an intelligence bundle, a list of routes by which the southern host moved at dawn, a name of a lieutenant whose journals held minutes and plans, a cipher used by a quartermaster. In exchange, Sauron would hold his conscripts, withdraw a wing of his scouts for 3 nights, and, crucially, reveal one truth: the location of an exile who might yet help them, an old strategist who had once read the maps of the enemy's heart. Bond would not hand over names of children, nor the names of those who bore rings of destiny. He would not betray those sworn to him by honor. He would, if necessary, choose a man of arms, a soldier whose life a general might calculate as expendable. Sauron's expression in the glass did not change as Bond laid out his ledger. The eye was patient as stone, but then the voice pressed like an iron thumb on the questions wound, proof or no bargain. Mark one now, and I will bind the oath. Name one who will bear the mark, and I will show you that my word will hold. I will still the march you require. The Palantir made room for silence. The hand on the screen lay waiting, unerring in its offered seal. That was the moment Bond had trained for his whole life. The point where words ceased and risk took a visible face. He could name a stranger, a captain of little note. He could name a foe whom he thought would not be missed. He could draw a thin line between treachery and strategy and justify it through necessity. All of those were options, pragmatic and clean, the kind of acts Bond had performed with a coolness that sometimes later, in darker rooms, surprised him. Yet there was an alternative he only allowed himself when all other instruments seemed blunt. He could give himself. The notion moved across him like a wind had moved a curtain. If he offered his own palm, if he let the Palantir make of him a living proof, he could hold the bargaining chip hard and visible. He could face Sauron knowing the mark was on him, a visible scar that would tie his fate to the peace he bought. He could, by making himself the seal, ensure that no ally must be branded, no innocent named. He would wear the proof so that others might pass unmarked. The cost was personal and deep. The mark would give Sauron a sight upon him, an instrument that could be used to read or to cajole. To be seen unguarded by that eye was to place himself within a predator's line of view. For a long breath, Bond considered how much of him he could afford to trade. He thought of a warm evening in a coastal city, of small, steady domesticities that were not his to keep, and then of 100 campfires whose warmth might go out if he failed. He thought of a ranger's oath and how binding that could be, and of how a single honest man sometimes had to become an instrument of lies to save more lives. He thought of the brand that would change how men faced him. He thought of the dread that one day it might bind him to an action he did not choose. Sauron's voice, when it spoke again, was almost kindly. It asked, as if inviting a guest to a table, whether Bond would give his hand as proof. "You think of loss," the voice said. "You weigh names as if they were coins. There is honor in offering oneself. It pleases me." There was no warmth in the last words, only the faintly amused impartiality of a thing that takes what pleases it. Bond's reply was not immediate. He let the silence widen until the Palantir's light felt intrusive. Then, in the calm that followed, he made his choice. He would not render another man into a mark because he could. He would not barter away a child's face or a lover's secret. He would be proof. He extended his hand toward the glass, and his palm was like a new map, folded flat, a place waiting for ink. The Palantir accepted him without haste. The image of his hand lay in the bowl, flesh and bone and life portrayed with cruel fidelity. The sigil formed, a slow, deliberate script of shadow that lifted from the glass like smoke made visible. For a heartbeat, Bond felt only the cool stone under his wrist, the faint tang of iron in the air, the way the Palantir tasted of old things. Then the mark kissed his skin, not pain but presence, an impression like a word impressed upon a mind. Bonds of will were not chains he could see. They were threads that would show only in the glance of an eye. Behind the brand there was an immediate and astonishing shift. Voices that had been keen and restless in the Palantir's portraits drew breath back. On maps and in the webs of spies, movements stilled. Sauron's promise given in exchange came like a tide, a holding of breath in the world. For 3 nights, the banners would not move. Scouts would fold, and the marches would slow. Bond had bought his respite at a price that would follow him like shadow. But the Palantir also gave him something else, a single revelation wrapped in bitter sweetness. In the deep of the glass, there appeared a doorway of memory, an old man by a salt-stiffened shore, a strategist who had knowledge of a past that could turn the calculus of war. The face was familiar to Bond, though he had never seen it before. The lines around its eyes spoke of a life spent reading other lives. Sauron's voice offered it like a thin mercy. "You have the location you asked for," it said. "You may use it to save those you would save." The mark on Bond's hand felt like a heat under a glove. He could not yet say whether he had traded himself for triumph or condemned himself to a servitude that would outlast the temporary stillness. He did not know if the eye's attention would one day find the small, tender things he loved and make them instruments against him. He felt only the cold and the promise, the way a man feels a rope take at his waist when he steps off a ledge to swing rather than fall. He drew his hand back from the glass and looked at the sigil there where no light could make it less true. Sauron watched him as if seeing into a ledger, and Bond met that gaze with the steadiness of a man who had chosen his hazard. The pact had been struck. The immediate threat receded. The question that now pulsed at the edges of thought was smaller, sharper. How long could he hold himself outside an eye that had seen him, and how far would he go to use the knowledge he had bought? The next hours would tell whether his body could keep what his mind had seeded. He stood, with the mark upon him, and the world held its breath between 2 decisions, his and Sauron's. The Palantir took him as a lover takes a name, not gently, not kindly, but with a hunger that measured him and laid him bare. The stone's face was a cold lake under an iron sky, and from its depths there arrived a pressure like a thumb laid across a pulse. Sauron's voice did not so much speak as arrange the air, drawing words out of silence as if the world were a thing he could set to order. Bond felt the room contract to that single point of attention. He could smell rain on black stone and the faint metallic tang of his own breath. The one ring was in his palm, its small band heavier than any iron he had ever lifted. It hummed, a thing alive in the skin, tugging at his fingers with the ancient cunning of hunger. "You have resources," Sauron's thought came, not a question, but an appraisal. "You have touched the cord that binds." Bond answered where his mouth hesitated. He set his diplomat suit and a spy's cadence aside and spoke in the blunt manner men used when they wanted to be understood by those who counted the cost of deceit in armies. "Resources enough to bargain," he said. He let the sentence cut, then added, softer, "Enough to save some?" From the Palantir, a light like a slivered moon narrowed to a blade. The eye did not spare him his history. It showed him faces of kings who had trusted words and fallen, of soldiers who had traded their lives for pauses at a table, of villages burned for a single lie. Bond saw not only the past, but Sauron's calculation of the future. The Dark One loved probabilities. He loved games in which men made themselves weak by thinking their choices were only their own. Bond needed counsel, a shaft of plain truth in the sluice of shadow. He thought of a different light, gray and distant as dawn seen through a forest. Gandalf's presence had always been a manner of insistence on the right thing, rather than the easy. He had no voice in the stone, not truly, but Bond had learned to read subtler languages than speech. He dug for that counsel like a diver for an air pocket. The Palantir obliged him with a sliver, a line of white in the distance, a hand clasped over another hand, a look between two men that held pity, rather than pity's obligation. Gandalf's counsel came less as instruction than as accusation. Remember the faces you would save. Bond let the memory slide into his palm like a cool coin. It steadied him for a moment, and then the ring tugged again, jealous of any attention not given solely to it. He had been a dealer of shadows once, making truth meaninable, precise, and useful. Here, his trades were heavier. They were weighted with the lives of the small and the broad. He could transform the Palantir into a weapon of misdirection. Sauron saw with keen logic and low patience. Bond decided to turn that into a weapon against him by giving it what it wanted, a clarity so sharp that it would be accepted as truth. He would supply Sauron a narrative crafted to look like confession and surrender, and in that confession he would hide and escape. "Tell me of terms," Sauron said, and the voice was a lowering of weather. "Tell me how the ring will be returned." Bond set the ring on the stone's black face where the light pooled, as though he might give it up by placing it there. For a heartbeat, the temptation to let it slip beyond reach clenched at his throat. He smiled without cheer. "Terms," he echoed. "You will accept an exchange. You will allow those you spare to leave the field unharmed. You will end assaults upon towns and keep your watchers from the roads for a season." The eye watched, hungry for rasping language. And proof? Bond had prepared an array of lies as a spy prepares forged passports. Neat, plausible, edged with half-truths. He put them forward one by one, quick hands and a tongue that folded. He would offer a public surrender, an act staged beneath the open sky, so that the free peoples would see him present the ring. He spoke it as though the act were a sacrifice. "I shall place it before you," he said. "Before all, sieges will halt. The leaders will be gathered. If you hold to your word, those who leave shall go free." This was the core of his lie, a bargain that would look like giving, and therefore buy him safety for those he could name. But he did not intend to give the ring. He had folded a darker plan into the surrender. In the ravening hunger of Sauron, a simple public ritual would render the ring visible and claimable in the eyes of all. Men would demand to see it. They would insist that they had been saved by his generosity. The world would be altered by his act. Once it was done, secrecy would be impossible once the right had been made public. The wrong could not be hidden. The Palantir leaned into that illusion with the avidity of a thing that knows it has a winner. "Prove it," said the eye, and the imperative was a blade. Bond felt the weight of the one ring in his palm like a curse and a key. Its metal was cool, and the inscription hummed, unheard in any tongue he had known. It pressed at his skin as if to remind him of its pact. He thought of Gandalf's grey light, the faces of small folk who had never sought war. He thought of the men who trusted a liar because they had no better choices. He thought of the ring-bearing itself, of mountains that would burn if it were set down in certain places. The calculus in his head evolved beyond tactics into what men had once called virtue and what he called necessity. He told Sauron another lie that smelled of truth. "I will bind witnesses," he said. "Emissaries from your host and our camp will oversee. An oath will be sworn. If you break it, The terms will be known, and the price shall be your vigilance. Sauron's appetite for certainty made the eye glitter. Bring riders, bring captains, bring witnesses, it offered, as if it were granting mercy. Bond thought of those riders, of the names and the faces that would come to see him bow. He thought about the rooms where mothers slept with doors bolted. He thought about Gandalf's light again and the ache of responsibility. He had made these people small in his choosing. He had crouched the world to the measure of a conversation in a stone. This was the spy's arrogance, believing a half-truth could stand against a mountain of hunger. Still, he had a plan buried beneath that lie, an act of misdirection curated with a surgeon's patience. He would bring with him a ring made to mimic the one, a ring of skillful forge and fool's gold, given a hue that might confuse those who would gaze too long. He had learned the Palantir's limitations. Its images were true where the mind accepted them. In a public exchange, under the watchful lens of Sauron's will, the trick would be in the gesture, not in the metal. A perfect parry to a great thrust. He would hand over a ring that would kindle Sauron's suspicion only once the contact had been made and the terms laid bare. By then, he hoped, those he meant to save would have stretched away under cover. His deceit cut him like a hand that had become his. Each fabrication sat heavy in his stomach. He saw himself in the Palantir as if someone else might mock him. A man in a black coat with an angel's guile. He had not intended to be a betrayer when he crossed into Middle-earth. He had intended to be a presence of cunning that might turn the scales. But cunning spoke a different language here, and each sentence of deceit made a seam in his honor. Gandalf's light returned faint as a star. It did not forbid. It did not bless. It was a cold, knowing gaze that named consequences. Bond felt it like a bone-deep cold. There was no absolution in it, only truth's refusal to be softened. He heard, perhaps within his own memory, the gray wizard's advice as plain as a bell. A bargain that trades promises for lives is not merely a trade of goods. It is a tally made on the bones of others. Bond closed his eyes briefly and let the Palantir see him do so. The world in the stone did not pause because he watched. It counted his hesitation as a weakness. Sauron detected the pause and pressed. When? At dawn, Bond answered, and the hour was a blade. On the third day hence, I will ride to the plain. I will lay the ring before you in sight of all. A shield of witnesses will stand between hand and hand. If you swear you will spare them, show it now. The eye calculated, as if pleasure lay in the arithmetic of delay. For a moment it seemed to strike a bargain with time itself. The Palantir's surface darkened, then a slit of red opened like the narrowing of a wound. Then make it public, Sauron said. Bond understood the trap as soon as the word left him. To announce a plan publicly was to promise safety by exposure. It would force him into daylight, where secrets could not shelter the weak. If he failed, the reprisal would be a thing not only to him, but to the scores that believed his promise. He had crossed a threshold. The act of inviting watchers removed the possibility of a quiet theft. The arrangement would compel him to perform under the scrutiny of allies and foes alike. He would be bound by the very witnesses he sought to console. There was another problem, as sharp as a spear, the ring's hunger. When Bond imagined the gesture of surrender, the palm out, the metal gleaming, he felt in the very marrow of his hand a pressure to let go. It whispered promises no diplomat had ever bargained for. Power without counsel, dominion without weight. It promised sight of ends achieved, of enemies soothed or crushed. He could picture a world remade with his hand at the center. He could also picture Gondor and Rohan and the fragile farms of folk who had never asked to be rearranged by fate. The ring did not speak in such terms. It spoke in the divine voice of the thing that would reduce them all to new furniture in its hall. Bond swallowed and tasted iron. The Palantir offered a vision to seal him, a pageant of his own likeness in conversing with kings, of banners lowered in his name, a rumor that he had chosen wisely. Sauron showed him what might be if he yielded. The eye took delight in the artistry of temptation. He could have refused. He might have thrown the ring into some hideaway and fled with a smaller life. But Gandalf's light and the faces of the innocent pressed upon him like debt. Bond had already spent courage in places where cowardice counted for little. He had traded safety for a chance to make a bigger gamble. Now, with the Palantir's gaze and Sauron's terms echoing, he chose a final calculation. He would make the public pledge and thereby force a condition no one could later undo. He told Sauron he accepted the terms. He told Gandalf that he would try. "Let the world see," he said aloud, and the Palantir gave him a cold, inner laugh for his boldness. He rose from the stone as if the gravity of that small ring pulled him upright. Men would come to see him make the exchange, and perhaps some would leave because of it. Others would gather to condemn him. He would stand in the field with the ring on his finger or in his palm, and the world would watch what he decided in the shine between them. There would be no private choices then, no room for trickery that did not include others in its measure. He had chosen the stage, he had set its lights, he had invited a witness who loved nothing more than the spectacle of power. As he left the chamber, the taste of the Palantir's light clung like dust. His hand was steady, though his heart was not. He thought of the forged ring tucked away beneath his coat, its cool begetting a small necessary lie. He thought of the weary faces Gandalf had shown him. He thought of the time left until dawn. Silence spread like a covering. The decision was made, but the performance remained to be played. He would go to the plain. He would offer a sight acceptable to Sauron. He would bind witnesses and swear the oath. And when the world leaned in to see whether a man could save many by betraying one truth, he would have to move his hand toward the ring, toward his lips, toward whatever salvation or damnation his fingers could find. He stepped into the night with the weight of a small bright loop in his palm. The plan he had chosen made him complicit. The faces he wanted to protect were now counted in his wager. Dawn would come. Soldiers would march. Watchers would gather. The only thing left to choose was how he would play the last public card, a move that could yet unmake or remake the very fate of Middle-earth. Smoke lay low over the plains like a promise that had been broken. It curled from cooking fires and from roofs not yet abandoned, from a kiln whose clay had hardened with no hand to tend it. The stars above were pale as old coins. A wind moved through the stubble, and in that thin breath something colder rode, an absence, as if warm air had been sucked into an unlit tomb. From the east came a sound like iron against throat, the distant hollow of a horn that could not decide whether it mourned or commanded. Men at the gates stood very still and listened. Women folded their hands and pretended otherwise. Children hid beneath great cloaks and counted their pulses. The gambit had worked in one sense. Sauron had come to the table, to the dark table, where Bond had set his signatures like chessmen. and he had taken the proof he demanded. A hand reached into the ledger of fate and touched an inked promise. For that proof, he had given a word, slender, black, but sincere in the only currency he understood. The word bought time and a sliver of quiet over the broad lines of the map. But words are not weightless in the shadow. They are hooks. They draw appetite. A rider came first, a wraith of a thing on a horse that left no hoof prints. Its cloak was a night without stars. Air froze where it passed. The sentry who saw it fell back and muttered prayers that had not been taught to him. Then another and another, until the horizon was small with black shapes that moved as a single hunger. Where Bond's ink had lain, where his lies had carved a shape of plausibility, the hidden servants of Sauron woke and stretched. The Nazgul moved like a storm across the sky that was not wind, but will. Their approach was not heralded by trumpets, but by the dying of small lights. Torches guttered and guttered, and the bell in the watchtower trembled with such low sound that it felt like the earth itself, breathing. Bond could feel the cost like a taste at the back of his mouth. He had counted casualties as carefully as any general might count coins. He had chosen a city, a border outpost whose fields meant little in the grand ledger. He had told himself sacrifices were theoretical, instruments of a larger gain. That neat arithmetic was a lie. The city was not a line on a map, but a skein of lives braided with laughter and grief. Children who had learned to stand by the river and pluck fat minnows were now running with sticks as strange talismans. An old woman who had mended shirts for 50 years packed her needle in trembling fingers and did not know what use a needle was when the sky trembled. The steward met Bond in the gates, huddled in a cloak that had once been a soldier's surcoat. He did not ask where Bond had been. He only said, "They come where your hand was laid." No accusation in the words, just the bluntness of someone who had seen his town called an accounting error and found his hearth counted as a cost. Bond saw then the true geography of his bargain. One life spared for many, one town surrendered like a chess piece to placate a king who loved power more than mercy. He had two choices. He could honor the parley. He could sign away a city to keep others breathing. He could write his name upon a second parchment and hand it to the writers as proof that men would bend. Men would live, perhaps, within the lines he drew. The price would be place and pride, but it would be clean in its cruelty. Or he could break the bargain. He could refuse to offer up the innocent at another's demand and watch war bloom like a fever across the green places. War would burn the maps. War would take more than a single hearth. Yet the alternative, papering over evil with promises, felt to Bond worse than the fire. He thought of the Nazgul close enough that their shadows fell like ink spilled from the same pen that wrote his name. He thought of the steward's clasped hands and of the child who slipped him a piece of bread earlier that day with the boldness of small people who trust strangers. He had been a man of many rules, but none that allowed a hand to be laid upon the innocent without answer. He tasted the bitter tannin of regret and found it stung more than fear. "Tell me what you will do," the steward said. The man's voice was small in the wind. Bond did not look at him. He looked out where the plain met the sky and watched the Nazgul begin their circling like birds of prey. He listened to the dull drum of hooves that did not drown, but only blurred the rhythms of lesser things. He considered the parchment that had carried his fallacy into the dark hand of Sauron. It lay folded in his cloak, the ink still wet in places where the dark seemed to drink light. He could burn it. He could make a confession public, rouse the city, and force men to choose while the enemy stood at the gate. He could break faith and accept the consequences, or he could stand with the parley, hand over what was demanded, and walk away with the knowledge that he had traded a town for a chance. An ugly, necessary calculus. The sky seemed to tighten around him as if the air itself were listening for the choice. Bond's hands moved then, not in oratory, but in craft. He reached into his cloak and unfolded the paper. The ink that Sauron had seen glinted like oil in a puddle. A signature laid upon a lie is a terrible thing. It dresses falsehood in ceremony and makes it legal. Bond could not let that ceremony stand unassailed, or the Nazgul would use it as a lodestar for claim and terror. He thought of how Sauron loved demonstration, loved proof. He would demand ritual and proof, and he would want spectacle to confirm obedience. Bond could give spectacle. He could give it a different meaning. "Gather the commanders," he said at last. His voice carried a small authority. "Bring them to the hall, all who can lift a pike." The steward's face split with sudden, complicated relief. Men ran into the streets. Lanterns were brought down. Word tripped over itself and spilled into clusters. Whoever Bond was in other worlds, here he had learned how to move men with a single, quiet order. They crowded into the hall, a place of timber and banners streaked by smoke and time. Bond stood at the head of them with no pretense of aristocracy. He smelled of horse, iron, and the cold breath of the shadow. Men spoke in small voices and asked small, urgent questions. Bond answered none at first. He held up the paper between finger and thumb, the signature visible like a blood stain. "You know what this is," he said. "You know what it will tell the riders when they come. It names what belongs to them and what is allowed to stay. It tells them who we will toss like chaff." The men murmured. Some set their teeth. Some turned their hands into fists. A captain near the hearth, an old guard who had lost more than he would say, looked at Bond as if measuring whether his life was marked by a brave lie or a cowardly truth. Bond folded the paper in half, then half again. He laid it upon the long table and, with a single sweep of his thumb, dragged a line across the black of the signature until the ink smudged and bled like a wound. That was the first small thing he did to break the bargain. It was a symbolic cut, but symbols mattered to their enemy. The Nazgul dealt in signs and claims. A smudged signature might be a reason to redouble fury, or it might be a pretext for pause. Bond was not naive. He knew Sauron would smell deceit in the air and answer with more hunger. He knew breaking faith with the Dark Lord could cost more than any one town had the right to pay. "What do you mean to do?" the captain demanded. Bond told them nothing of plans yet. Plans are brittle until they are held in the palms of many. He told them instead of what he would not do. "I will not sign away homes," he said. "I will not barter children for silence. If Sauron wishes proof, let him come and take it by force. He prefers spectacle. We will give him spectacle that kills his servants." The words were not a promise of victory, they were a promise of motion. Men understood motion. They read courage as a thing that bent air. They prepared. Bell ropes began to ring. Banners were hauled down and lashed. Men slid into mail. Women took up where they could and set herbs to smoke in windows to confuse scent and heat. A child who had watched Bond move earlier came forward and laid a carved wooden horse upon the table. "For luck," she whispered. Bond took it and did not smile. He tucked it into his sheath, for luck is a small weapon, but sometimes the only one left. Outside, the sky had roped itself in cold thunder. The Nazgul were nearer. Their riders were a black smudge at the edge of sight. If Bond had kept the parley, then those riders would have a paper to show like a warrant. They would take the city in a manner that would pretend legality to horror. If he broke it, they would come with rage, not law, and that might be worse for some and better for others. He had made a choice. He had chosen the immediate defense of the place over the abstract promise of fewer deaths across larger distances. He had chosen to stand where he could see faces and hear names. Now he must turn intention into strategy. He considered the plain and the limits of his allies. There were men enough for a night ambush, but not enough for a pitched stand against wraiths. Steel could not touch them. Ordinary spear did not hold terror. The answer would be in cunning rather than in force. The thing Sauron loved was spectacle and proof. Bond would use that to make him wrong-footed. He would give Sauron a visible token, a bait that would call the Nazgul here, but the token would be a trap. It would lure them toward the stench of smoke and the flash of mirrors and the iron bells that had been consecrated and cursed in old rites. He would have rangers hide with rope and simple iron, and archers would watch for the flicker of shapeless cloaks. He would make the dark think it could take what it wanted and then show it the price of assumption. There were other instruments too, less straightforward. Tokens of Sauron's own superstition could be turned. The ink, the parchment, the echoed name. These things had power because men gave them power. Bond had placed them as if they were currency. He would now make them counterfeit, not to grant Sauron cause, but to grant his enemies a cause to move. He would make the bargaining chip into a bell that would ring and mark the beginning of the end of one cycle and the start of another. For all the cunning of petty kings and dark lords, they were not infallible. They believed in signs. They could be misled. He gave the orders in short bursts. Scouts were to ride for the ridge and light a signal that would appear a surrender. Archers would take positions where they could not be easily seen. Bell ropes would be looped against the wind to give a sound like 1,000 insect wings. The smiths would heat iron until it glowed, then throw it in a spread that might turn a night thing's path. If anything was to be burnt, let it be strategic. The dried thatch at the east wall to give the appearance of weakness, then a sudden waterwork to quench it and reveal hidden men. The plan was not elegant. It had the desperate beauty of a thing stitched at the last moment. A messenger came in with a face like flint. "The riders are close," he said. "They do not come for negotiation." His words were simple and terrible. Bond nodded. "They never did," he said. "They come for proof that we will obey. We will give them proof that we do not. Then we will give them something else." The first bell was struck not by clanging metal, but by Bond's choice. He had severed ink with a thumb. He had refused to be the man who exchanged a town for peace. That refusal would lead toward a war neither he nor the steward wished, but it was a war with purpose and with names. It was not abstract. It would have faces to be mourned and faces to be defended. It would be dangerous, and it would be final, not for the world yet, but for the night that had been pressing like a hand to a throat. Outside the hall, men took up their places. Lanterns were lowered until only pale coins of light dared the black. Bond slipped the smudged paper into a pouch and tucked it beneath his armor as if carrying a bleeding thing. He did not expect mercy. He expected consequence. He also expected choice to ripple outward like a stone tossed into a wide pool. One decision had been made, now actions must follow. He stepped toward the southern gate where the watchers were huddled, and as he walked, the last light of the west died all at once, a curtain closing on a day that had chosen between faith and action. The riders' black shapes pooled on the far line like oil. Bond felt the cold of their approach sharpen into a hunger. He moved into the night with his order ringing in his ears, and with the knowledge that his next move would not be small. The voice that answered him came from no throat he could place. It was the grinding of iron upon thought, a cold logic rendered audible, and it promised neither mercy nor malice, only calculation. Where that voice touched the air about Barad-dûr, the world shifted, as if a gear had been withdrawn from a great machine. Siege wheels creaked and stopped. War horns that had been bellowing a promise of slaughter sagged into silence. The Nazgûl, circling far above on leathern wings, paused hunched like vultures at the edge of a storm. Their keening died away as if some hand had laid a cloth over them. Bond felt the change as a pressure easing from his chest. It was the kind of relief that tasted of iron and rain, and already he knew it had been bought at a precise, terrible price. Sauron did not lower a sword or show a face. He offered instead an instrument. From the shadow at the tower's crown there came a thread of darkness, thin as a whisper, yet colder than any winter wind Bond had walked through. It found his palm and laid itself upon the skin, not with fire, but with a small, intimate pain, as if a ledger were being written upon his bones. He heard written words without letters. He felt clauses like hooks. The bargain was narrow, and it was ruthless. Bond had always dealt in impossibilities made probable. He had never before signed with the marrow of his hand. The engines of Mordor ceased their motion not because they had been destroyed, but because they had been promised other knights. The tall orc sentries blinked, confused, and lowered rough shields. Catapults stood like beasts that had been stilled. In the gray between Leviathan smoke and ash, the hosts that had been poised to trample the living retreated like tidewater, coaxed back by a subtle current. Below the shadow of the dark tower, men who had been grasping at spears let them fall and listened to a silence that was both gift and complication. Some cried, some laughed. Most did nothing but stand and breathe as if they had been granted a reprieve from a fever and could not yet trust their limbs. There were faces in that crowd Bond had no claim to know, yet their gratitude clung to the night like smoke. They would call him Savior. In the telling that suited them, they would name the narrowness of his choice in softer voices when men slept and thought better of fewer things. He took none of their hands. He did not turn to accept their thanks. His coat hung heavier with the ash, the collar stiffened by something darker than soot. Where the thread had touched his palm, a faint sigil smoked for a moment and then sank away. The mark would be visible only to him, and to those old enough in shadow to read such signatures to others, it would seem merely a scar, just as his conscience would be marked in a way no blade could show. He had bartered not only time, but obligation. The compact was precise, a breathing space for the free, an interval in which the West might mend fences and hoard strength. In exchange, Bond's freedom to walk as he had walked was curtailed. He was pledged by a word that was now a cold sinew in his wrist to answer when the dark voice summoned. He would relay tokens, bring information, serve as a broker, between a light that had no eyes and a world that still hoped to see by daylight. The terms had no honor in the way men understand honor. They were instead the bargains of a spy and a tyrant, clauses inked in the currency of necessity. Bond felt those clauses press against his ribs like a second heart, ticking with a cadence he would learn to obey. In the aftermath, the tone of the battlefield altered. Commanders exchanged maps and whispers. Healers picked through the injured with hands that trembled. A young captain, his face lined with soot and grief, took a step toward Bond and then stopped, as if unsure whether to bow to a savior or spit at a traitor. Bond watched him and said only this: "Make for shelter. Draw back. Live long enough to what comes after." The voice was the same it had always been when dealing with lives as if they were chess pieces. It was not cruelty, nor was it comfort. It was the blunt instrument of necessity. The captain gave a huff that might have been a laugh and set his men in motion. Night spread, and the stars hung pale and indifferent over fields that still smelled of blood and iron. From the distance came the clarion of centuries, the little rhythms that tugged a man back to small duties. Bond walked among those duties like a man who had been given a mirror and found himself in it. He checked straps, straightened cloaks, whispered a few technical things that steadied the hands of the younger officers. He moved with the practiced economy of a man for whom every second costs, lives his tradecraft, honed across a different world of smoke and neon, found purchase among the mundane urgencies of tents and ration lines. For a time he was merely useful, and in that usefulness he found a thin respite from the weight at the wrist. Yet the compact sat in him like a promise and a wound. Once, when the moon caught the scar at his collar, he saw a motion in the darkness, an eddy of shadow that took shape and unmade itself. He knew then that the bargain would be enforced by eyes not wholly his own, by means not wholly human. There would be summons and noon dispatches and midnight whispers. There would be moments when the world would ask him to betray his kind, and moments when betraying his kind would be the only way to keep more from perishing. He understood the calculus. He also understood that calculation would reshape him. The man who had once slipped between lines and left no trail would now carry an invisible leash that would tug at him in the quietest hours. He thought briefly of the sea, of London rain, and the iron smell of a bar before dawn. Those memories, once so steady and anchoring, now seemed remote, like places in a life he had not yet chosen to mourn. A single moth struck the lamplight and folded away, and Bond thought of small irritants that once had seemed unworthy of keeping. Duty, he had learned, accumulates like lint in a pocket until one day it clogs the clasp. He smoothed his coat and closed the collar tighter against the ash. There was a neatness to his motions that the men around him could read. The coat kept the wind out. The coat kept the mark from prying eyes. It was a thin defense against a fate more intrusive than any enemy's bullet. Somewhere within the ring of shadow that now softened the march of Mordor's engines, Sauron's voice amused itself with small adjustments. It did not forgive. It merely delayed, the way a trapper might coax an animal into a snare with the gentlest of tugs. Bond felt those tugs as obligations that would not break. He also felt, beneath them, the steely clarity that had carried him through darker rooms than these, a purpose neither noble nor base, but necessary. He would keep the compact so long as it bought people time. He would do so knowing that time could corrode and that delay was sometimes only another name for the same terrible end. This truth aligned itself in his chest like a compass needle, steady and prickly with unease. When morning came, it found him at the border of the camp, watching the line where the ashen plain gave way to scorched earth, and then, farther still, to the thin, green memory of places that refused to yield wholly. Men assembled with the cautious energy of those granted another day. A council convened and then dispersed, hushed. Plans were made to fortify fastnesses and to send word westward. Bond was not invited to those councils, nor did he expect an invitation. He had become, in a fashion, a node between dark and light, and nodes are rarely honored with applause. They are polished and used. Before he left the camp, he took out his hand, the one with the sigil now paler, as if ink had bled inward. He turned it in the light and watched the skin flex and the faint print fade and then flare for a heartbeat like coals under snow. He tasted ash and possibility, and the world smelled suddenly very large and very cruel. Then he tucked his hand beneath his coat, set his jaw, and began to walk. His steps were measured the way a man marks the distance between safety and obligation, between what is won and what is bought. He did not stride for any city known to the maps that men held. He walked away from the light and toward the long, low line of shadow that ran from Mordor to the places in between, the quiet paths where summons might find him and where he might choose his answers. His feet found the old rhythms of exile, the steady, unglamorous pace of someone who had made a bargain with a force that could not be reasoned with, but must be kept at bay. He was both victor and exile, a man whose hand was steadier and heavier for the choices he had made. Ahead, the road folded into dusk, and then beyond, into tasks that had no name and yet demanded to be done. He walked toward them, and the compact in his flesh listened like an instrument waiting for the bow.